don't really actually, but no one considered. I actually have hypersensitivity. And I got what are they called? Ear defenders and earplugs. So I put those. It's still here. But now I haven't even.
So we'll do the first ready to go, yeah, when you're ready.
Okay.
Okay, I'll come back in a
I think
bit.
we can start. Or
Sorry?
I think we can
We
start.
need to do so hopefully it's
Yeah, somebody normally announces you, I think. They do the other ones, don't they? Unless you announce
Oh, no, I already said that today. I can do that. But is the recording here already?
Yeah, I'll come back in a bit.
I'm not sure if they were going to do this anyway, but I heard that maybe they were going to put me to a different office.
Right. Hello, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much for your interest. Thank you very much for coming to the presentation today. So I don't want to take too long with the presentation, so I'm aiming for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes maximum. And the idea for those I see mostly familiar faces, of course, but those that I haven't met yet, my name is Hanan. I'm a new lecturer in the department. And the idea for today is that I want to present to you a line of research that I started developing during my PhD, and a line of research that I'll also like to take on the next few studies that I have in mind. So the whole idea is about the role of metamemory in eyewitness testimony. So the context is, imagine you witness a crime and the police arrive, start to ask you some initial questions about what happened or some descriptions of the perpetrator. And at a later point in time, during the investigation, the police finds a suspect, and the suspect can either be the guilty suspect, so okay, they got the right person, or it can be an innocent suspect. And as you can imagine, the problem when we have an innocent suspect is that you're putting that suspect at risk of being identified, and that evidence can be used against this person. And ultimately, this person can be convicted because of it. So if you look, for example, at data from the Innocence Project, that's specifically from the US, the data that I'll talk about, but the project exists in many different countries, and now the presentation starts working. That's when you put too much stuff. Oh, there you go. Okay, so they have analyzed over 300 exonerations so far. I think now it's 350 or something. And looking closely at that data, that accounts for more than 4,000 years of innocent lives spent in prison. And that's an average of 14 years per exoneree, innocent lives spent in prison. And looking more closely, what we see is that eyewitness misidentification play a role in over 70% of those identifications. So that's the problem that we're trying to deal with. And one way to tackle the problem, of course, is to try and understand which factors can be used to estimate eyewitness performance. So in the context of eyewitness identifications, we know of three good predictors. So, for example, decision time, so how fast the witness is in picking the person from a lineup. So witnesses that are very fast and straight away choose the person, they are more likely to be correct. Decision processes, so if you ask witnesses, how did they come up with the choice? If they said, for example, that they started by eliminating options and coming up with the best match, so to say, they are more likely to be incorrect. And those that pick someone straight away are more likely to be correct. And confidence, generally speaking, it is a good predictor of accuracy as long as other factors have not influenced confidence, so that confidence has been inflated. So, for example, if the police administering the lineup gives some sort of positive feedback to the witness, and I'll thank you very much for your identification, you identify the suspect, that will be very helpful in our investigation, then you cannot really use confidence anymore as a predictor of accuracy. So those are good predictors. The problem with them is that they are all very much correlated. So decision time, decision processes, and confidence, they don't add much to each other. If you have one of them, there is a lot of shared variance in there. You cannot tell a lot by having the three of them. And they are all susceptible to other factors that undermine the usefulness as estimators of performance. So, as I said, confidence, for example, can be inflated, and confidence is only a good predictor at the time of the identification, not when, for example, you have the witness during a trial. You ask them how confident they are that that's the defendant is the person that committed the crime. So the idea is to try and look for new possible estimators of eyewitness performance. And in my PhD, I suggest that metamemory factors will be a good candidate as a new estimator or predictor of eyewitness performance. So when I say metamemory, it is a quite broad construct, but one definition is the knowledge and awareness that an individual has about his or her own memory capabilities. It is important construct because it does predict behavior based on what we think about our own memory, dictating how do we report about confidence, and also how do we deploy cognitive resources. So a classic example is a student preparing for an exam and has to decide how much time to dedicate to that material to do good in the exam. So they have to actively think about what are they learning, do they feel that they mastered that content or not, and judgments of learning. So in the future you ask how likely it is that you're going to remember this in the future. If they see material in front of them, it could be talking about feeling of knowing. So do they feel that they know that material or not? Do they feel that they recognize this person or not? Source monitoring, memory strategies. And so because of a very broad construct, the studies I'll talk about, they'll focus mostly on memory strategies and memory self-efficacy. So strategies basically, what do people think that help them remembering better in the future, specifically in the context of face recognition. What do they think make them encode better a face to retrieve it in an identification task, for example? And memory self-efficacy, basically what do you think about your own memory in terms of your memory ability? Do you think you have a very good memory and not so good memory? Do you think it depends on what we're talking about, whether or domain-specific aspects of memory? So do you think your memory for facts is better than memory for faces? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So across our studies, what we were interested in was in the relation between those constructs and accuracy, confidence, over-under confidence, and susceptibility to misinformation, everything in eyewitness context. Okay, so I'll not talk too much about suggestibility to misinformation. I'll talk mostly about how metamemory relates to accuracy, confidence, and over-under confidence. So in our first study, we focused on eyewitness identification setting. And across all studies, what we will have is a phase in which we obtain some sort of metamemory assessment. So the way it looks like, it is, for this study, it was two instruments. So the multifactorial metamemory questionnaire and the subjective memory questionnaire. And those include many different factors tackling different aspects of memory self-efficacy. So, for example, contentment, ability, strategy, and memory development. So, contentment, my memory is worse than most people, other people my age. So, it's more like how do you feel about your own memory? And ability is a bit more objective. So, how often do you forget an appointment? So, there are slightly different factors all tackling the construct of memory self-efficacy. Okay? So for this study, there was a very simple standard eyewitness test identification paradigm. So participants saw mock crime, short mock crime, burglary and bike theft, to keep in the theme of Portsmouth, kind of. And after a very short interval, they completed the lineup identification task. So I won't not get into too much detail for each of the studies. So there's a lot of detail in that I'm not mentioning. Lineups could be either target present, target absent, but I will just give the gist of the studies and just talk about the main findings. Okay, just to get some ideas going about this line of research. And in the end, the idea for today is I would like to hear your thoughts and about this general aspect of this line of research. If you have any ideas, how would you go about moving forward? And I'll have share some of my ideas as well. For this specific study, we had objective memory tests as well, because we thought, okay, one thing is talking about memory self-efficacy and how that relates to performance, but why not also test objective performance? So how do they perform in different memory tests and how that relates to the identification accuracy? So the subjective and more objective part, and comparing those in terms of the predictive value. So there were 3 tests. The idea here, so face recognition, acute recall test, a general knowledge test. So the idea is to have a range of different tests of either similar or not similar domains. So the idea is that the face recognition test would be the best, most predictive of the identification task in relation to acute recall or general knowledge. Okay? And this is how the whole procedure looked like. So first, participants completed an online meta-memory assessment with those instruments, and then they completed the eyewitness paradigm. So mock crime, short interval identification, and between subjects, all the memory tests. Okay. So the main analysis, again, a lot of details, but I'll just give the main analysis. Typically, in this type of research, you separate analysis for choosers and non-choosers, because those tend to generate entirely different pattern of results, because it's a different behavior. So choosers are either anyone that picks someone from a lineup, non-choosers, anyone that rejected the lineup. So the reason to separate is because those that pick, they either recognize the suspect or they confound with an innocent suspect. Those that reject the lineup, they have several different reasons for rejecting a lineup. So then is why we separate those. So the models look like this. I don't know how much you can see, but it was identification accuracy predicted by contentment, ability, strategy, and memory development. So the 4 factors that I briefly mentioned before. And when we are estimating accuracy, we include also identification confidence as a predictor. When we are estimating confidence, we include identification accuracy as a predictor, as a proxy for strength of the memory trace. Okay? If anything is unclear, if you have questions about, I don't know how much is clear so far. So this is what we found. So basically what we found is a lot of non-significant results. So that's kind of like what you can see here. But those are high-density, Bayesian high-density intervals or credible intervals. It's a way to look into non-significant results and try to be a little bit more sure that indeed that's a null result. So what we see in the figure here is that we have the predictors there and posterior estimate of what is the estimate for that predictor. And they all seem mostly concentrated on 0, which is an indicative that indeed those factors are not predictive of identification accuracy for choosers or non-choosers, except for memory contentment. So how content you are with your memory. There's a weak effect on accuracy, a weak relation with accuracy. So it's slightly predictive, not by much. So what we learned from this is that apparently what do you think about your own memory does not tell whether you'll be able to correctly identify someone in the future. So if you think I have a great memory or not, it really doesn't matter. It's not predictive. Okay? So that was interesting, but we really wanted to be sure. So we conducted another experiment Also, moving further a little bit by testing different mock crimes, because in the first experiment we only had one mock crime, and and a few more participants in there to have more precision on those high density intervals. But the main difference is that we have different mock crimes. But basically, we found almost exactly the same pattern of results, which is interesting. Okay, at least replicates the null results. So then we can be memory contentment. It is then now we have even more precision to say it is related, but it's so weakly related that we cannot really say okay that's useful in that context. And what was also interesting here is that those predictors, those factors were predictive of confidence. So it does relate to how people express their confidence. It's not only dependent on the memory trace, but also on what they think about their own memory in general. Which was very important to find, because there's a big discussion on how do we express confidence. Is it only the memory trace that we have, or do we take intrinsic factors into account? And we are showing evidence that the intrinsic factors are relevant. And that informs us, how should we be using confidence as a predictor of accuracy. Okay, so final aspect of this study is, as I mentioned, the objective memory tests. How does it relate to identification accuracy? And the answer is that it doesn't. So yeah, we have basically study one, classic, with a bunch of no significant findings, which in the end, I find interesting, as long as you can tell, with the Bayesian test, okay, you can really say that those things are not related, and it has a contribution to theory, how we understand how our beliefs and thoughts about our own memory reflects in how our behavior. What is interesting, though, is that confidence is somewhat stable. And it is more stable the closer the memory test is to the identification task. So, I don't know how much you can see, but the beta value is there. This is general knowledge, 0.20, acute recall, 0.29, face recognition, 0.35. You see a pattern that face recognition is the confidence you express in the face recognition test. It's somewhat related to confidence you express in identification task. So again, the intrinsic factors that seem to be motivating the confidence statements. Okay, so that was it for the first study. Moving on, we were thinking about this, and okay, so how can we get more predictive value out of these assessments, out of those meta-memory factors? And the first thing that we consider is that there was a bit of a problem with assessment. Like those factors, you may have noticed, at least from the example items, they are very general. They are very broad. So we ask, what do you think about your memory? And okay, so how much does that relate to how you perform in an identification task, talking specifically about face recognition? So to move on and improve our assessment, what we decided to do, because we couldn't find at the time a specific scale on memory self-access for face recognition, we constructed instruments. And after exploratory, confirmatory factor analysis, the best factorial solution that we found for this instrument was a three-factor solution: contentment, discontentment, and strategies. So some of you may be surprised to see contentment and discontentment separate, right? Why is it not one thing? And if you think about it, and if you have an answer for that, I would like very much to talk to you. So, first thing we thought is that this was emerging because of some sort of method factor. So the phrasing of the items were influencing the factorial structure of the scale. So we tested for this as well. There are a few different ways you can test whether the phrasing or the method factors are affecting the structure of your instrument, and it doesn't. And those are actually weakly 0.35 correlation. So yeah, it does minus a negative 0.35, of course. So it does seem that there are somewhat separate constructs. That's something I'm still thinking about, and thinking about a few studies to dissecate those differences. But we're talking about those self-efficacy and strategies. So how often do people use strategies to remember faces in the future? So just one note about memory strategies. For example, one item is I often create a visual image in my mind of a face that I want to remember. We didn't think about those items in terms of they work or not, whether they are efficient strategies. We just think about any strategies. And the idea is that are people using strategies or not? Okay, just to be clear on that. So for the next study, we tested this scale as a predictor of performance for biased and unbiased lineups. So why testing biased and unbiased lineups for our next study? Oh, so just to be clear on that, what do I mean by a biased lineup is that in a biased lineup, the suspect stands out in any way. In an unbiased lineup, the suspect does not stand out. In this case, what we have in the unbiased example is that the fillers, so that if you consider that's the suspect, the fillers match the description of the suspect. So they are all equally important or potential alternatives for the witness to choose. In a biased lineup, many of the fillers do not match the description of the suspect. So if you have an innocent suspect in that case, and the innocent suspect somewhat resembles the perpetrator, then the suspect is at a high risk of being identified, if that makes sense. So that's just to give an example, a case of Michael McAllister, it's the one on the right, which was wrongfully convicted. I think it's sort of sexual assault case, and if I'm not mistaken, it was 28 years that he spent in prison. And you can see a striking resemblance with the real perpetrator who confessed at a later point in time, and then was also found more evidence that indicated that was indeed the perpetrator, not Michael McAllister. So that's why it's very important that those unbiased lineups are constructed, but that is still not always the case. Those are slightly more difficult to conduct, especially if you're using, for example, a live lineup with photos is a bit easier, but still, even the necessity of it is not very aware yet. But another very important aspect of it is that biased lineups, they undermine the usefulness of the predictors I was talking about before. So confidence, decision time, and decision processes, they are not anymore good predictors if you have a biased lineup. That's because the suspect stands out. So when the witness picks the suspect, they are very confident. But that's because the fillers are not good alternatives. Okay? So that's how the procedure looked like. Again, metamemory assessment, mock crime, filler task. In this case, we had 2 identifications, one for the perpetrator and one for the victim, to have more identifications per participant. But between subjects, it was always all biased lineups or all unbiased lineups. Okay? Again, a few details that I'm not going to get into. But then we found something interesting. Well, there are no results I also think is interesting, but what we found here this time is that one of the factors of the scale that we developed was predictive of correct identifications, and which was most interesting for us is that it was predictive for both biased and unbiased lineups. So while in biased lineups you don't get good prediction from, for example, confidence, decision time, etc., it seems, at least with this study, that the metamemory is not as affected by the bias in the lineup as those other factors. And then we argue that's because it's a more intrinsic and, forgetting the words now, it's an intrinsic and a permanent trait. Your metamemory is not going to change. If you say lineup now, if it's biased, and then later on you say unbiased, your memory self-efficacy theoretically will remain somewhat the same, if that makes sense. So to give an idea of the effect size, so to say, the odds ratio of 0.57, that's like, what is this? But just to give an idea, so the lower end of the discontentment, so people that are, well, not discontent, if that's a bit confusing, but they are around 80% accurate. And people on the upper end of the scale, so those that are very discontent with the ability to recognize faces and individuals, are around 25% correct in their identifications. So those are the extremes. So it seems quite big, but again, this is the extremes. So just to give an idea. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the next part of the next analysis of this study, I'd just like to quickly explain a few things about confidence-accuracy relationship in eyewitness research. So a few studies in the beginning would focus mainly on the point by serial correlation. So confidence, how does that relate to accurate or inaccurate? And it's okay as a statistic because it tells you something about what is the general relation between confidence and accuracy in eyewitness context. It's not great because it doesn't tell you, for example, if you have a witness in front of you in a trial or in an identification and they say, I am 100% confident that this is the perpetrator. If you have a correlation of 0.22, what does that tell you? Is there 100%, what is the likelihood that that identification is correct? Mm-hmm. So it is a limited statistic in that sense. So what a lot of many researchers are doing now, at least in this type of research, is using calibration analysis for confidence accuracy relationship. So the idea here is that we have different categories for confidence, so 0 to 100%, for example, and we're checking how accurate witnesses are in each of those levels. Okay, so the dotted line would represent the perfect calibration. So if they are 100% confident, they should be 100% accurate when they say that. If they say 50% confident, then they can be 50% accurate, 50% inaccurate. Okay? So if we plot some data here, just to practice a little bit the interpretation of those results, that's not a very good calibration. Like it's all over the place. This is an example for, and here you see underconfidence. So they give low levels of confidence, but they're actually very accurate. Okay, and there you see some example of overconfidence. So they say they are very accurate, but actually they're not. They say they're very confident, but they're not. So from this, you can get a few statistics that will tell you how well calibrated participants are in that experiment. Basically, it's how distant it is from the perfect calibration. It's either absolute distance, which will be calibration, or a relative distance, which will be -1 perfect underconfidence, +1 perfect overconfidence. Okay? Okay, so this is some data from the same study I'm talking about, biased and unbiased lineups. And we do see that individuals with, this is a very bad legend here, but this line here, the dotted line, it's low contentment. So people with low contentment, they're generally better calibrated. Slightly better calibrated than people with high contentment. And what you see is that people with high contentment, they tend to be overconfident than the ones with low contentment. And we do sit down, that's super small, you can't see much, but the pattern here is that that's the case for every single factor in our scale. So low contentment, low discontentment, and low memory strategies, they're all indicative of better calibration. Which is a bit, again, if you think about it and have a good explanation for that, why both low contentment and low discontentment indicates better calibration. It's still something for us that's a bit difficult to explain. What we are arguing is that people that have not extreme opinions about their memory, they are better calibrated. So if you have one extreme opinion, one way or another, then it will be less calibrated. Okay? So another way of looking at this is plotting the confidence intervals for the different groups, low group and high group. And we see that for the contentment strategy and discontentment, they are less overconfident. And those here, the high factors here, they are more overconfident. Okay? So I won't talk about too much of these last two studies, but I'll just briefly explain the fourth one. So for the fourth study, we ran multiple identifications. And that's because when you have one single identification, you cannot tell whether that participant is being overconfident or underconfident. So the idea here is that we wanted to predict for a specific participant. Can I tell whether you're going to be overconfident or underconfident based on your metamemory traits or not? So if you have one witness saying, oh, I'm 90% confident and they are accurate, you cannot say whether they are underconfident or overconfident. But if you have many observations for each participant, you can see that this example here seems someone that's slightly better calibrated. So high confidence, accurate, low confidence, inaccurate. And the other one, it's not very well calibrated. It's giving a lot of high confidence responses, but most of them are inaccurate. Okay? So that's how it looked like. Again, metamemory assessment. Each participant completed 8 identification tasks. And that's the model. So outcome variable predicted by the metamemory variables. And in this case, we had to run multi-level because each participant is disclosing many responses, so repeated responses there. So we had random intercepts for the lineups and for the participants. And here, what we find is that the contentment factor of the scale was a significant predictor of correct identifications, correct rejections, and false identifications. Okay, all in the direct, expected direction. So more contentment was associated with more correct identifications, more correct rejections, and less false identifications. Okay. All right. So I mentioned that we ran the multiple identifications to try and estimate. Can I tell whether you are going to be underconfident or underconfident based on the metamemory trace? And the answer is like no. So those are not significant. There's one significant, which is contentment. That indicates that you're going to be overconfident, but that's small, again, very small effect size. So again, it's insignificant, but we like to say, yeah, there's not much of a relation there. So for our fifth study, it's slightly different context. So far we've been talking about identification tasks, and there's very little research on trying to estimate performance in free recall settings. And so that's what we did. So you will notice looks very similar to our first study. We also had the objective memory test to try and predict free recall performance. And this is data from the free recall test. And what we see is that people are very, very accurate. So that's the mean there. It's around 95% accurate. Okay, so like ceiling effect, if you want to call it. And here, our question now is, was the task too easy? Because, as you see, the procedure, mock crime, 5-minute interval, free recall. And we ask them to disclose as much information as you can and try not to guess. So you see that they will be very accurate. So our question is it too easy, or is that because it is a free recall task? Because the free recall task, like, people choose what do they want to disclose. So, and especially if you ask them not to guess, what you tend to observe is that they'll disclose information that's likely to be accurate. So what we need is a few more studies with varying degrees of difficulty just to check, like, do you still see that figure or not? Okay, so we can't talk too much about predicting accuracy because like we'll be predicting something that was 95% accurate. We can talk about predicting disclosure of information, how much information our witness is going to disclose, depending on what they think about their own memory and everything we've been mentioned so far. And the answer is like, again, we cannot. So how good do you think your memory is or not does not relate to how much information you disclose. Okay? So just to show like interesting different patterns of calibration across different memory tests. So the worst, it's on the face recognition. So like completely opposite from what you call perfect calibration. We think that was the most difficult task. So I had to study 30 faces, and then later short interval, and then sell old or new face for 30 faces again. For all the 3-week tasks that we had that was not eyewitness specific, we observe a similar result, similar pattern for the calibration. Okay. So I'll not talk too much about this study, and there's actually no slides about it. It was just very briefly, we had people trying to our witnesses were either suggested to misinformation or not, and we're looking to whether the meta-memory would relate to resistance to misinformation or not. And guess what? It doesn't. Yes. So what we see across the board is that eyewitness-specific meta-memory measures may be reliable predictors of accuracy and confidence. Remember the bias and bias lineup study and the multiple identification study. They both pointed towards, okay, there is some predictive value in that. Confidence is more diagnostic of accuracy when taking meta-memory facts into account. And what we found very interesting, especially for theoretical contributions, is that expressions of confidence are somewhat stable across similar memory tests. Okay? So some limitations, there are specific limitations for each study, of course, but across the board, I mean, for the studies we've conducted so far, those were the 2 main limitations that I can think of. We still need possible testing of potential other effects. In most of these studies, we had first the meta-memory assessment, and then the identification task. In reality, you would of course have the identification task and then the meta-memory assessment. So we plan to do it this way. We reasoned that the effect of the meta-memory assessment on the identification task will be less than the effect of the identification task on the meta-memory assessment. So that's a starting point, but that's something that has to be tested further. And we had very short retention intervals, because of course that's good to start with, because longer retention intervals means slightly more difficult research to conduct, but for further research we need a more realistic retention interval for those studies. So a few ideas that I have for future directions. First, I'm working on a theoretical paper, putting up some of those things together and try and motivate more research in this area. Propose intersections between meta-memory and witness research. So identification performance, disclosure of information, and susceptibility to misinformation. I want to reanalyze the data to look more specifically into how that relates to proclivity to choose. So are witnesses more willing to choose or not, depending on the meta-memory trace. And also further investigate other individual differences. And I really want to work as well in a tutorial paper of our package that we created. I say we, but most of the work as a master's student that I had at Mastery University. It was incredible. She learned in 6 months and created this package, and I'm keeping using it. And I want to implement a few new functions in that package, and then, of course, create a tutorial package for that. Because I already know that people are using it. People keep getting in touch. Oh, I'm trying to run that. There's this one thing. Is it correct? So I really want this tutorial paper so that people can make the most out of it. I just wanted to briefly mention other projects that are either ongoing or very close to ongoing. And I would just know that a few people in the room have interest in some of those areas. So yeah, just wanted to mention, so anyone interested, maybe wants to get on board and discuss a few ideas about that. A few studies on assessing jurors and judges' knowledge of eyewitness memory. This is a paper under review now, Norwegian judges' assessment, what do they know about eyewitness evidence? And we're thinking about theoretical review, meta-analysis on that as well. A few studies on improving evaluation of eyewitness evidence by trials of fact, so using teaching aids, for example. And studies on examining the medium of exposure, live video, 360-degree video, and virtual reality on eyewitness memory, encoding phase I'm talking about. And investigate the role of arousal on eyewitness memory. Okay? So if anyone is interested in a few of those papers I was talking about, there's a lot of it available on my OSF page. There's also all of the data and all of the code in there if anyone wants to have a look at it. So that was pretty much it, what I planned. So thank you very much. Okay, so I'd love to hear any ideas you may have about any of those things. If there are any questions as well, like I didn't go too specific into any of the studies, but I'd be happy to discuss. Yeah.
Did you check the face validity of the items, the factors for the contentment and discontentment?
Face validity.
Yeah, so you can do a think aloud study to find out how actually the participants are answering the questions. Are they answering based on what you thought the items are measuring, or are they answering it a completely different way? So that might explain why you're getting...
Yeah, we didn't do that, and that would be, of course, we'll have to do that. No, I mean, like, that's a great idea. I mean, what I've done is to check again and again and again and again the content of the items. And first I thought, maybe one is more related to familiar faces, one is more related to unfamiliar faces, but there is still like quite a big mix in there. So both of them have, familiar faces, unfamiliar faces. But I think asking the people responding to that will make it much clearer to understand if there is a difference. And part of the reanalysis that I want to do is again check the factorial structure when we have more data on that as well. Yeah.
But my thought on that issue is that it's maybe not a continuum like we think, from discontent to content.
Yeah.
And my first thought was that it's like health. Sorry. Well-being. Yeah, where some people think, well, I am well because I have no illnesses, and other people think, no, I'm well because I'm really happy. I've got all those positive well-being characteristics. So the contentment, it may not be just a continuous scale. Contentment may be measuring, how the positive nature of you and your memory, where the discontentment is measuring problems. And it's not a continuum.
And not necessarily a continuum. And you could argue maybe people will have a little bit of both, in a way.
Well,
right?
But they may, the parts of my memory that are working well, I'm really happy with. But I have a couple specific problems, or I have no specific problems, but my memory is just like, okay. So they may actually, if they don't come up as the same factor, then they have to be separable. So they're not on a continuum, otherwise they'd be
the same
the
thing.
positive and negative.
Exactly. They'll be just reversed items.
So that was my first thought, is this positive health versus problem-oriented health. That kind of disconnect.
I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think maybe asking if it indicates to some of that reasoning, then it will be much clearer. And you could argue that also the relation there is 0.35, which there's not actually a lot of shared variance in that. So they seem to point to different things, and we call it contentment, discontentment, because that's our interpretation of the item. So it could be something more specific than that.
Could be contentment and problems.
Contentment and problems. I like that.
really my question.
Yeah, okay.
So you have a huge sample
Uh-huh.
on all of your studies.
Oh, I should have mentioned as well, some of those ends, they are identification observations, for example, just to clarify a
It
little
does
bit.
make a little bit of difference.
Okay.
When I first came to Britain, one of the things I asked the students to do was to say how well, what mark they thought they would get. And I actually incentivized that because I said if you say you're going to get a mark that's very close to the mark that you actually get, you'll get extra marks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Interesting.
And the Brit, and this was 20 years ago, but the British students all said, I'm going to do okay. They all said, like, I'm
Don't
going
aim too high.
I'm going to do good. And so nobody got
The
bonus points.
bonus, oh wow, okay.
And
They were a bit afraid.
in America, people might have overestimated, but there would be a considerable number of people that would get bonus points.
Uh-huh.
So my question is,
Yeah.
there must be differences in confidence across cultures. Are all your sample UK students or Dutch students or not students but other people?
Yeah, that's a good point, and some of those samples, they are different. So, for example, talking about the first study that had 2 experiments. So the first experiment was all conducted here and just advertised on Facebook, social media, so people from slightly different places, but mostly UK and the Netherlands. And the second experiment was entirely conducted on MTech. So Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the platform, it's mostly workers from the US that work on those surveys. And so those very different samples, populations, I would say. Although like the results were like almost the same. Yeah. So something I should mention about the online study, especially for MTech, they had to do a few exclusion criteria to guarantee the quality of the data, especially for the MTech sample, like MTech bots and all of this stuff. But it is an interesting point. I wonder like how much difference would we see across diverse culture, but something to think about. Yeah. But at least in that example, I mean, it's UK and US. Those seem to point to the same direction, at least for that specific study. Yeah.
I was very struck by the calibration curve for your face recognition task.
Oh, yeah.
So is that new? Has that been shown before? Because that's really interesting. People just have no idea about their face recognition ability.
Yeah.
And if that's true, it seems to undermine a little bit your meta-memory question about face performance, right? So you ask people what they think. It turns out they've got no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it seems to undermine in a way, because for the calibration there is showing like people have no idea for that specific task. The older evidence suggests that they know a little bit, like when you talk about the prediction of identification performance, then you see like the predicted value in that, then okay, they have some idea. So that's why I wonder, for that specific task, again, my first thought is that was it too difficult? Because then if people see like 30 faces for a little while, then short interval, and then another 30 faces, that's a new or old, then they start giving like confidence, like, oh, 80% confident, but no, inaccurate. 90% confident, inaccurate, if you know what I mean. So it would be good to check a little bit more into like what is the typical calibration in this type of test, even though there's a lot of variance in that, like those face recognition tests, like they have all kinds of different tests, different trials, different stimuli, so we have to dig a little bit into to really see if there is one pattern that occurs specifically for face recognition tasks. Yeah.
It seems a really original finding.
Yeah. Maybe I should emphasize that a little bit more.
As you know, my cognitive load, so the question that you're asking about free recall, or whether you're the method was too easy. And I've put forward a cognitive load and I've done the 3 recall. There is a difference in accuracy.
Okay.
So, and it goes from sort of quite high, 97% or something, down to like nearly 90. So there is and it was a significant difference. So
Okay, that's
if you increase the difficulty.
That's very interesting. Is that proportion accuracy? Like from
Yes.
all of the information they give,
Yes, that's,
they'll give less correct information if there is cognitive load.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Next step. Yep, Steve.
I wonder if we know whether people in the legal system, such as lawyers, may be aware of this evidence of the limitations of memory, and if they may have more modest estimates of their own memory, and if any research has tested that, because then I start to think about applications to investigations. For example, when politicians often will claim, when it seems to be politically convenient, that they don't remember something. But maybe sometimes it's also because they're aware that often our memory isn't as good as we think it would be.
Yeah, I wonder like how could that put this type of study with like memory experts, for example. I wonder if they will all be like a little bit more like, I don't trust much of it.
Because many politicians are lawyers. So.
Yeah. But it's interesting to think about like how much access they have to this information as well. Because I do think if they're a very good lawyer, I would guess like if it benefits them, then they'll find this information. Then they'll find a paper showing that eyewitness evidence is unreliable. Even though like the evidence doesn't say it's unreliable, it says it can be contaminated, same as other types of evidence. It's not necessarily always unreliable. But yeah, I do wonder like how much access do they have to that. So some of the studies I mentioned, like when we ask judges and juries, then Anna would know a lot more about that. But you typically see that they don't know a lot. So they assume like confidence is always a good predictor of accuracy. It's not always the case. So in that sense, there is a challenge that it's getting more of that research out there so that people can do a better evaluation of the evidence they have in front of them. Because sometimes we do see the case of miscarriage of justice. There are many reasons to believe that you shouldn't be using that evidence at all. By the common sense that if someone says, point to you, say, you are the person, most people will believe it. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much again.